Hey, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. I'm Stephen.
And I'm Daniel.
And we're continuing our first 500 years series on the history of the church. We're currently situated in the 2nd century. We have the apostolic generation, those who either followed the apostles, knew the apostles, or knew people who knew the apostles. We're in that era, so let's say from the year 100 to the year 160. And there's one topic that I think casts a pretty big net, and it is the question of when Christians are gathering for worship, namely Sunday, the Lord's Day, and why that's kind of significant. So, to kind of get into why we'd be doing this topic, Dan, what do you think? It's kind of like a good vehicle, right, for a lot of the big themes of the 2nd century in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Because if you recall in our first century episode that we did on a first century liturgy, we had come down on the side of saying that many early Christians most likely celebrated their Eucharist on Saturday evenings. That was probably the primary day for many Christians in the first century. That might come as a surprise to many people, just because of how in stone Sunday worship is for us. But in the 2nd century is when we start to see Sunday morning in particular emerge in many places throughout the Christian world. And that development leads to other discussions. There's going to be the Quartodeciman controversy, a debate over the day of Easter, which involves Sundays. There's going to be what we call the parting of the ways, the idea of the separation between Judaism and Christianity begins to happen in the 2nd century, and the day of worship has something to do with that. So there's these large overarching themes in the 2nd century that have their roots in this very discussion.
Well, yeah, I think it's pretty fascinating that we're already talking about, like when you mentioned like the roots of the Quartodeciman controversy. I think it'll come just as a surprise to a lot of people to know that already, in the early to mid 2nd century, you'll have churches that start debating about when they're supposed to be celebrating Easter. Pretty fascinating. I think especially if you're coming from a more like a low church Protestant point of view, you're probably going to be surprised by that already you have people who knew the apostles or followed the apostles questioning, well, wait a minute, when are we supposed to be doing this Easter thing that we do? So it brings up a lot of interesting points about the development of feast days, the development of not only the liturgy itself, but the liturgical calendar. And you mentioned the parting of the ways. So the idea that Christianity and Judaism, emergent rabbinic Judaism and Christianity are kind of starting to go their separate ways slowly but surely. But you also have embedded here Christians almost as the Romans are seeing them. That theme is playing in here because you have most of the descriptions of early Christian worship that we have are actually Christians writing to Roman officials.
Yeah, luckily the Christians had to defend themselves to the Romans, and that's how we get a lot of descriptions of the early liturgical assemblies.
Yeah, and particularly for our purposes as the Catholic Brothers, of course, of interest to us is going to be the development of Rome's conception of herself. How are the other churches viewing Rome? The development of the papacy. So those kinds of themes are also brought out in this, especially as you're looking at what is the Roman tradition of worship, what day of the week, this kind of stuff, versus what's going on elsewhere. So it brings up a lot of questions about the government of the Church of Rome at this time, her authority. Lots of themes to dive into here. So we kind of assume all too often as Christians of modern times that Christians have always worshipped on Sunday morning, kind of like we do, but not so fast, because we have a lot of options actually in the sources. You have kind of like a lot of scholars will say, well, no, it's Sunday morning, Some scholars saying no, Sunday evening. Some are even saying no, they're holding the Eucharist on the Sabbath day. So we do have some options here, right?
Well, first from the scriptures themselves, and we kind of covered this in our first century episodes, but Christians were celebrating the Eucharist daily, it says in the book of Acts. Okay, so yeah, that's happening on a daily basis. What we're concerned with here is the primary day of worship. Yeah. What is the primary day of worship for early Christians? And this whole discussion is made very difficult because in the ancient world, there are predominantly three ways to tell time. Okay, there's the Jewish way, there's the Greek way, and there's the Roman way. If you're a Roman, you look at the world and you count the days from midnight to midnight, like we do today. We adopted the Roman system.
Right.
If you're in the Greek-speaking areas of the Roman Empire, you're counting the days as dawn to dawn. So right when the sun comes up, that's the start of the day until the next sun comes up. Okay. If you're a Jew in the first century and the second century, you are counting your days evening to evening. So the Sabbath for them started on Friday evening and went into Saturday and ended Saturday evening. So how they perceive days, it's three different ways. So, for example,
and this speaks particularly to before you continue. It's a good point because it speaks to the kind of movement that Christianity is. Like Christianity is Roman, it is Greek, three, and it is Jewish.
And what I was going to say is that when in the scriptures it says that the Christians collected offerings on the first day of the week, or that the Christians gathered with St. Paul on the first day of the week and broke bread. Yeah. What do they mean by the first day of the week?
Right.
To a Jew, the first day of the week would begin Saturday evening. To the Roman, it would begin at midnight, and to the Greek, it would begin at dawn on Sunday morning. So, so we don't know. It's important for listeners to know this, that there is no explicit reference in the first and second centuries of someone writing down saying, oh yes, we Christians celebrate the Eucharist and worship on Sunday morning. Literally. There is no
Sunday as rendered in this timing.
Yeah, Sunday as rendered by the Romans. Yeah.
Right.
So that source doesn't exist. So that creates a lot of ambiguity in the sources and a lot of room. Yeah. So our argument was that, we tend to decide with the scholarship that says that the earliest Christians, their primary day of Eucharist and worship was Saturday evening because of the practicality of it. You can have arguments back and forth, and scholars do. But we liked the practicality of the Saturday evening gathering because you have to think, who makes up this church in the first century and toward the turn of the century? It is still mostly Jewish Christians. Yeah. Right. And so you think about, how would a Jewish Christian approach the day of worship? Well, they would still maintain the Sabbath. They would still want to maintain the Sabbath. But you also have in the early Christian sources references to the first day of the week and references to what they called the eighth day, which is a clear reference of the day after the Sabbath. Okay.
Yeah.
So we like the practicality of Saturday evening for this reason. When a Jew would wake up, or a Jewish Christian would wake up on Saturday morning, they would go to synagogue, and they would have their Sabbath readings, their study time, whatever they were doing in the synagogue. We're not even sure what they did in synagogues on Saturday mornings, but then we know they gathered on Saturday mornings. So a Jewish Christian could wake up, still go to synagogue, still partake in the readings, still partake in the lessons. And then in the same 12-hour period, once 3 p.m. came along, they now could regather as the church and celebrate their Eucharist, celebrate their agape meal.
And this also does depend on where you're stationed and kind of what your function is in the church at the time. So you have, for instance, if you're an apostle like Paul, right? It says that he would go to the city and he would enter the synagogue as was his custom. Well, not only, on weekdays would Paul do this, but presumably he would enter it on the Sabbath day, which is kind of the high day when the most people are there. You can get the most bang for your buck in terms of an evangelist. So Paul is walking into these synagogues while his fellow Jews are going in on the Sabbath, preaching, getting kicked out, and then in the evening, celebrating the breaking of the bread with the brethren, but then also locale, right? So if you're in Jerusalem, it was the apostles' custom, clearly, as the book of Acts says, to go up to the temple to pray and then back to the homes, as we mentioned in our worship episode, to break the bread. So that was their custom. Well, it makes sense then that when you move out to the diaspora, that the apostolic custom would have been synagogue in the morning, breaking the bread in the evening, and then the Christians, the earliest Christians, would have sort of carried at least the pattern in some way or another, whether that means going to the actual Jewish synagogue or whether it means, gathering together in the morning for the Sabbath, for exhortation reading like they do in the Sabbath, and then kind of bleeding into Sunday evening to have a Eucharist, right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So it seems to us practical that Saturday evening was the day. The other reason why it seems that Saturday evening was the primary day for Eucharist and worship for the Christians is simply because it's called the Lord's Supper. It's not called the Lord's breakfast. And I mean that seriously. It's not. I'm being serious. It's not called the Lord's breakfast. It's called the Lord's Supper. It's a depnon in Greek. It's a dinner. It is a supper. So we know it has to be happening in the evening, and even well into the 2nd century, the agape feast of the Christians can't be separated from the Eucharist. That's not something that happens until you're into the 3rd century. So again, a supper has to be happening, and you have to ask yourself practically, is there any evidence of early Christians gathering on Sunday evenings? And there just isn't. Mm-hmm. We do have evidence of Christians gathering on Saturdays. And so again, that seems to be the answer. That Saturday evening was the primary day for Christians to gather and worship and celebrate the Eucharist. Not everywhere, but I would say for the most part.
Yeah, it doesn't make much sense if, when we're talking about the Lord's Supper, like you said, a depnon meal, that would be happening on Sunday evening, mainly because
among Jewish Christians.
Yeah, because the Judaic influence for the earliest Christians in Eastern lands, Near Eastern lands, when we look at these sources, we have to look at them not just as kind of like 21st century, readers. We have to try to also think kind of anthropologically when we approach historical sources, because it's one thing to just like take the content and then run with it, but it's quite another to try to think like, well, how quickly do traditions typically change in these ancient cultures, right? Like change happens so fast for us in the modern world. It's like boom, 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 boom. Like within 10 years, like we can change something like completely how we do things, like how we celebrate Christmas or or the latest Hallmark holiday that shows up, right? In the ancient world, it is not so. It doesn't work that way. It takes a long time for customs to change, die out, new ones to come in, and then even when new ones come in, they identify it. They're like, well, this is new, So when you have that strong apostolic and Judaic influence in the early church, it only makes sense that, like, why would they be celebrating any Eucharists on Sunday evening when that would have been actually like the second day of the week for them?
It'd be a meaningless day to the Jews. Right. Yeah, it would have been Monday to the Jews. Yeah, exactly. the Monday, the Sunday scaries.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So Monday would have no significance if you are a Jew, and it would have no significance if you're a Christian. So it's like, why would they be gathering?
And even random, even in the earliest Christians, when we'll get into why they were choosing the first day of the week, but part of them choosing the first day of the week had to do and was related to Jesus' resurrection, of course. And when you think about resurrection, you think about the rising sun. Remember, Christians face east to pray, towards the rising sun. Okay, everything's about the rising sun. Everything's about the east. Everything's about resurrection. So to celebrate your primary worship on the evening of the day of the sun, when the sun's actually going down and you're no longer facing the sun when you're in your worship because it's now behind you, if they're explaining their worship theologically, then you would think that they wouldn't choose Sunday evening to be their primary day for Eucharist and community gathering.
Right. Well, and also it makes some practical sense that, again, Saturday evening, because it would be seen for Jewish Christians, it would be seen as kind of the consummation of the Sabbath. You know,
And
it's
so
like
here's-
the Sabbath finally comes to
Yeah.
its pinnacle, and now it's time for the agape or the Eucharist. So,
Yeah, and to that point, when you're thinking about that Saturday evening, to the Jewish Christians, that Saturday evening, of course, is Sunday. It is the first day of the week. Now, most people would probably assume that Christians did in fact choose Sunday to worship because of the resurrection. I mean, that's what we even call Sunday Resurrection Day. Many Protestants do. It's Resurrection Day, and every day is the Easter.
Yeah.
Every Sunday is the Easter day kind of thing.
Right.
But actually, in the earliest sources, so I'm speaking of Ignatius of Antioch. I'm speaking of the letter of Barnabas. Even Justin Martyr himself. They named the resurrection of Jesus as a secondary reason for why they worship on Sunday. The primary reason for choosing Sunday worship or first day of the week worship, which could be Saturday evening, is something they refer to the day as the eighth day, okay?
Mm-hmm.
The day after the day of rest, which refers to the eschatological day, right? The coming of the Lord kind of day, the Parousia, the second coming. The eighth day in Jewish thought was that future day of the Lord. And so when you think about the Sabbath and then the first day of the week, holding your Eucharist on that Saturday evening was a great way to enter into the eschatological day, the eighth day.
And that's a great point, because you have Justin Martyr in his dialogue with Trypho, you have Melito of Sardis, and you also have Origen of Alexandria eventually describing that there was this early tradition that Jesus's return would actually happen on a Sunday. Mm-hmm. That was also the day of eschatological expectation of Christ's return.
Would you really hold your primary Eucharist on Sunday night when Sunday, the day, has already almost passed? No, you would think that they would hold it on Saturday evening in anticipation of the great day. So this is how the letter of Barnabas puts it. He says, quote, "Finally, he says to them, quoting Scripture, 'I cannot stand your new moons and your Sabbaths,' end quote. You see what he means. It's not the present Sabbaths that are acceptable to me, but the one that I have made. On that Sabbath, after I've set everything at rest, I will create the beginning of an eighth day, which is the beginning of another world. This is why we spend the eighth day in celebration, the day also on which Jesus arose from the dead, and after appearing again, ascended into heaven.'" So his first reason for choosing it is this kind of eschatological reason. And then he says, it's also the day that Jesus rose from the dead.
Yeah, and that's also, it's a familiar psalm, but in Psalm 118, verse 24, we hear, "This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it." It's kind of like a preeminent verse liturgically in the church. Well, you actually have like Clement of Alexandria and actually Cyprian of Carthage. They actually mention that psalm as referring specifically to the Lord's Day. So there was already this idea that like this literally is the day that the Lord has made as part of this new covenant.
Right.
So there's a lot going on here,
and that's why they're calling it the Lord's Day. That's why the sources for us can be ambiguous, because they're not saying Saturday evening. They're not saying Sunday. Right. They're saying the Lord's Day. That was the nomenclature of the time. And to them, what's it referring to? It is referring to the day of the Lord in the Old Testament. This is the day that the Lord has made.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, the reason then for everybody to know like why this is a little more difficult than you would initially think, it's like you said, because of the time rendering difference, but also just because of the sources. We don't know when the sources are speaking of like, oh, and then in the evening they did, or in the morning, like, well, on what day, what day is it? And even if you say the day, how do I know like what time you're rendering it? But the sources are also very sparse. They're vague, and they're also, every time that you have a source, you always, as a good historian, have to ask yourself, well, does this speak to the whole, or does this speak to the part? Does this speak only to the region? So if you have a source that's stemming from Rome in the mid-2nd century, you can't necessarily apply that to the whole, eastern block of the Roman Empire. So you always have to kind of be careful as well, and be measured in how far you let a source lead you, to conclusions.
Yeah. Well, here's a good example. So I'll go back to Pliny's letter. So recall that Pliny is a Roman governor of Bithynia. He's writing about the Christians in the early 2nd century.
Which, if everybody remembers too, Bithynia is the region where Peter did a lot of his ministry. But yeah, go ahead.
So Pliny writes to the emperor. The Christians asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by oath, not to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, not to falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. Okay, so from that you would think, okay, they're meeting in the morning, so it's probably Sunday morning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pliny goes on. When this was over, it was their custom to depart and to assemble again to partake of food, but ordinary and innocent food. Even this, they affirmed, they had ceased to do after my edict, by which, in accordance with your instructions, I had forbidden political associations. So what Pliny is describing there, he doesn't, again, unfortunately, he does not tell us what day. He just says on a fixed day of the week. The Christians are gathering in the morning for some kind of prayer service, probably some readings, and then they break and they come back together for food, which is reference obviously to their Eucharist. We don't know of Jewish services on Sunday mornings, but we do know of Jewish services on Saturday mornings.
Yeah.
Okay. And again, there's a lot of Jewish Christians still within the church. So it's more likely that Pliny is referencing a Saturday, a typical Saturday for the Christian community.
Yeah,
at least in Bithynia, right? A morning gathering of prayer and worshiping Christ, and then an evening gathering of the supper, the Lord's Supper.
Well, apart from just Bithynia, but we can also apply that to the region around Smyrna, because in the document, The Life of Polycarp, we have a description of sort of what the Smyrnians were doing at this time. So Paeonius, who's the writer of The Life of Polycarp, which I believe he's early 3rd century, is that right?
3rd century father, yeah.
Yeah. Early 3rd, I think, yeah. So he's writing this. He's the Bishop of Smyrna. So he's writing this, describing the life of Polycarp based on the traditions that he's received in his own see. And remember that Polycarp was Bishop of Smyrna, so he's sort of writing down in a way the history of their little church. But he mentions, and he says, on the Sabbath, and pay attention to the words here. So on the Sabbath, when prayer had been made long time on bended knee, he, Polycarp, as was his custom, got up to read, and every eye was fixed upon him, and the lesson was the epistles of Paul, and so on and so forth. So you can see that this is like teaching, readings, exhortations, okay? After they describe Polycarp's ordination, it then goes on to say, after this, the others also, having made the proper exhortations and appeals on the Sabbath, and then on the Lord's Day, the offerings and the Eucharists, rejoicing and partaking of food, and then returning each to their own home, greatly, rejoicing at having communicated with Polycarp. And then it says, and then on the following Sabbath, he said, hear my exhortation. So you can see that every single time in this source, it's tough. This is a tough source, but every time that the Sabbath is mentioned, the Jewish Sabbath, you hear it's a common theme: prayer, exhortation, reading. And then the minute that the Lord's Day comes up, all of a sudden you see sacrifice, offering, Eucharist, meal. Everyone goes home rejoicing.
So again, what that shows us is a respect for the Sabbath among many Christian communities, first off, and that the Sabbath was in fact a day when Christians did gather for at least readings, exhortations, prayers, ordinations, all those types of things. What's ambiguous in this text, again, is what he means by the Lord's Day. Yeah. Does he mean that they met Saturday evening, or they waited until Sunday morning to then have the Eucharist?
Yeah.
That leaves it ambiguous. But again, the point here is that the Sabbath was a respected day, especially among a lot of the Christians of the East. And what you are seeing in Pionius' source from the 3rd century is really the leftover tradition from a time when the earliest church gathered on Saturday mornings. Even if for Pionius the Lord's Day now means Sunday morning, it suggests that it wasn't always so. For as long as the supper remained the primary form of Eucharist, that's for how long Saturday evening remained the primary time for Eucharist. However, as you move from the 1st to the 2nd century, what happens when many, many more Gentiles are becoming Christian? You have an influx of Gentiles into this church. What happens when Christians begin to emphasize their distinctiveness over and against the Judaism of their day? Right? Yeah. So you have this. So what we're talking about is you have this fine line between the Sabbath ending and the beginning of the first day of the week. But when more and more Gentiles come into the church, are they automatically going to be attracted to the Sabbath? Are they going to see their Eucharist as the culmination of the Sabbath, or are they more likely to see it as the beginning of something else, something different, something distinct? And the answer seems to be the latter, that as more and more Gentiles come into the church in the early 2nd century, they are not viewing the Sabbath as the previous generations were viewing the Sabbath. They're a little more suspect of the Sabbath, and they don't see their Eucharistic meal as having any great connection to the Sabbath at all. And so you start to see that in beginning in the letters of Ignatius. Ignatius writes a letter to the church in Magnesia, and he says this: "If then those who had lived according to ancient practices came to the newness of hope, no longer keeping the Sabbath, but living in accordance with the Lord's Day, on which our life also arose through him and his death, which some deny, the mystery through which we came to believe, and because of which we patiently endure, in order that we may be found to be disciples of Jesus Christ, our only teacher. How can we possibly live without him, whom even the prophets, who were his disciples in the Spirit, were expecting as their teacher?" So Ignatius is saying that we don't celebrate the Sabbath. And so even if Ignatius' communities were celebrating Eucharist on Saturday evening, he's still trying to separate that event from its association with the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Either that,
and we see the same thing in a. Go ahead.
Either that, or he's telling Jewish Christians and some Gentile Christians who might even still be celebrating the Eucharist on Friday evening, on the Sabbath meal evening, telling them, no, you can't celebrate then. You got to come celebrate with us over here, because this is, of course, a new day, the eighth day.
Right. And in a contemporary source, the Epistle of Barnabas, which we've mentioned before, to the eighth day point, so that people know, Jews had to circumcise their child on the eighth day, right? So that's where this eighth day idea is kind of coming from, is that the new circumcision, so there's kind of a new eighth day. It's like a new entry into a new covenant. So the Epistle of Barnabas, 15:8, it actually mentions the Lord's Day as an entrance into that eighth day, the new circumcision. And then, of course, when you come to Justin's apology and Justin's dialogue with Trypho in the mid-2nd century, that's when he is also mentioning this whole eschatological expectation of the eighth day entering into this new covenant in a way.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. So So where does that leave us? I mean, so just to step back from kind of the details, I think we've made our point that this is why it's kind of difficult, to determine, or at least a broad brush, what is the practice of the early Christians. So it's kind of like, it's pretty difficult. But what can we say that we know, for sure about the development of like, okay, now we're moving into a time where we're starting to really talk about like Sunday morning, like as we would know Sunday morning. Like,
yeah,
when does
again, so if more and more Gentiles are coming in, you do have them disassociate themselves from the Sabbath in thought first, but then eventually, obviously, in practice. You already have the idea that Sunday, that the Lord's Day is the day, okay, even if it is Saturday evening. But Gentiles coming in render things in the Roman time frame, okay? So it's very possible that many, many Gentiles coming into the church are kind of reading back on the church's history and seeing even in the scriptures where it says the first day of the week, they now are thinking in terms of Roman rendering of the week, right? So Sunday is kind of the day. So there's this maybe a practical push there. You can think also of maybe there is something to this ban that Governor Pliny talks about. He banned Christians from gathering in the evenings, okay, because there's clandestine things going on. And you can't have groups gathering in the evenings in the dark. We don't know what's happening. So we don't have a lot of other pieces of evidence that directly tell us that, but maybe we can assume that if one governor in a part of the Roman Empire is banning evening gatherings of Christians, maybe that's happening elsewhere throughout the empire, which would leave the Christians with no choice but to celebrate in the morning. And what day would they pick? Of course, they would pick Sunday morning because they were already considering it the day of the Lord. We have already in the middle of the 2nd century a source called the Gospel of Peter. It's an apocryphal gospel. And in there, it's clear that the writer of that gospel views the Lord's Day as Sunday, and he specifically states it as Sunday. So the Lord's Day now is being defined specifically as the day of the sun. So that's there. Perhaps Sunday mornings took on a more Eucharistic character, also because, and maybe we haven't mentioned this. It was the practice of Christians to take the leftovers from their suppers to other members of the community who weren't able to attend the supper. Well, if you think about it, when would that be? It wouldn't be in the evenings. It would be the next morning where they would take some of these leftovers to the rest of the people who couldn't be there. And so already in the minds of Christians, you have a Eucharistic almost character or context for Sunday morning. Because it was probably the time when they were distributing Eucharist to folks, or people were coming to where the presbyters were and receiving the Eucharist. Now, Tertullian of Carthage speaks of that. He speaks of, he doesn't tell us again what day, but he says, we do meet together at daybreak to receive the Eucharist from only the hands of the presbyters, from only the hands of the presidents among us. But again, is that a Eucharistic service, or is it just a redistribution of the already blessed sacrament? We don't know. But he is beginning to mention those kind of morning episodes. And so in the minds of Christians, okay, maybe they're already associating Sunday morning with Eucharist.
Right. Yeah. Now, we do know that when we come to Rome by mid-2nd century, I mean, at least from my reading of the sources, it seems pretty clear that we are kind of talking about something with Sunday morning, right?
Yes. So many will say that Saint Justin Martyr, in his Apology, is the first clear reference to a Sunday morning Eucharist, because he does say that the Christians gather. I'll just read it. The Christians gather on the day of the sun. So this is Justin Martyr. Okay, so he says, and on the day called Sunday, the day of the sun, all who live in cities or in the country gather together to one place, and the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read, as long as time permits. Then, when the reader has ceased, the president verbally instructs and exhorts to the imitation of these good things. Then we all rise together and pray, and as we before said, when our prayer is ended, bread and wine and water are brought, and the president in like manner offers prayers and thanksgivings according to his ability, and the people assent, saying, Amen. Mm-hmm. And there is a distribution to each, and a participation of that over which thanks have been given, and to those who are absent, a portion is sent by the deacons.
That's great. So this is exactly what we were talking about. Why this plays into the whole theme of Christians as the Romans are seeing them too, because it seems like in that source you kind of have a smashing together of all these things into one event that in other sources seems to be very separated, where you have like kind of like we were saying, like a Saturday Sabbath, like morning, everybody's getting together, there's exhortations, there's teachings as long as time permits, there's prayers, and then they break and then they come back together for a Eucharist. Well, one thing is that in the Roman Empire, and especially we're talking about the city of Rome, right? Remember, this is where the emperor is for the most part. Like, this is where he's seated. This is where Christians have been publicly burned alive by Nero. This is where Christians have been, like Ignatius,
100 years earlier.
Right.
The emperors knew who the Christians were in the city of Rome.
Right.
Justin's writing in the 150s, and Nero, persecuted the Christians in the 60s of the first century. So you got about 100 years there where the Roman people know who the Christians are.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you have Christians who are being very publicly in the arenas, like Ignatius of Antioch, thrown to the beasts, murdered. So, and the other thing is that, like you had mentioned, Rome is not okay with secret meetings in the night, especially from cults that talk about a different king, okay, or a different lord. That's not going to fly. I mean, even the cult of Mithra was persecuted by Rome because they had clandestine meetings. It was viewed with suspicion. And remember what we talked about I don't know if it was last episode or a few episodes ago, but talking about the whole idea of legal religion and illegal religion or illicit religion in the Roman Empire. The Christians are still not considered a legal religion. They're not recognized. So to also, on top of that, to have like secret meetings in the capital of the empire, that's not going to fly, right? That's not going to fly. So the Christians have to adapt in Rome. And so I find this to be the most likely explanation, that you do actually have a time at some point in Rome where that Saturday evening Eucharist is kind of combined to what used to be a Saturday morning exhortation reading, all moved to the Lord's Day, the day of the sun, Sunday morning.
Yeah, and that could have happened in the first century. It could have been from Peter himself, or it could have been in the second century. That's fine. And the other thing to piggyback on that, what's interesting is that Justin Martyr is describing his experience in probably a Syrian community in Rome and how they celebrate, and he's mentioning a front-loaded liturgy, like you said. There's prayers and readings and everything going on, and then there's the Eucharist. That's not how it was at the Christian suppers. At the agape feasts, it was the other way around. You had the meal, and the Eucharist was somewhere in there. Okay, the bread and wine was somewhere in there, and then after you had the symposium time, you had the prayers and the singing and the exhortations. So actually, it's flip-flopped now. Yes. And there's more time given to, probably in the morning, some readings and exhortation, and then time for a smaller portion of a meal, bread and wine, water, is brought for this liturgy in the Roman territory.
Yeah. So we can assume that many churches, not all, but many churches of the eastern region of the empire, maybe specifically in Asia because of the sources that we have, are still practicing like what was, typical to them. That, they're having a Saturday night Eucharist. possibly a Saturday morning still exhortation, or whatever. They may have at this point added on a Sunday morning something or other, prayers, exhortations, preaching. But for the most part, when we're talking about what is the proper time to celebrate the Eucharist, they may have still been accustomed to doing this kind of Saturday night thing. But when you're talking about Rome, we really are talking
Rome
about
or elsewhere. Rome or elsewhere. There's
Rome. Yeah. You may have more other places as well where it's accustomed, but we know at least just by the source material that it is Rome by mid-2nd century that they're doing this on Sunday morning. Now, this bleeds over from merely a weekly difference to an annual difference. So that's what I want like our listeners to start to cue into, is that we're getting closer and closer to when we come to the early 2nd century, we're going to have something called the Quartodeciman controversy, the whole idea that you have a whole block of Asiatic churches that are celebrating the feast of Easter.
Pascha.
Right. The Pascha feast, they're celebrating it on the 14th of Nisan when Jews are celebrating the Passover. And they're saying that this is the tradition we received from the Apostle John. And then through Polycarp and so on and so forth. Well, then you're going to have, and we're going to do an episode on this, but you're going to have Victor of Rome who is saying, well, not so fast. We received a tradition from Peter, and that is to do it on the nearest Sunday to the 14th of Nisan, because the Eucharist can only happen on Sunday, you know? So that's very interesting by the time you get to the early 3rd century. But for our purposes here, you actually do have this very fascinating episode in the mid-2nd century. So we're talking about the reign of the Bishop of Rome, Anicetus, who reigns from 155 to around 166. And it's during this time that a big controversy breaks out between a lot of Eastern churches, specifically Asiatic churches, that were celebrating Easter on the 14th of Nisan in accordance with the Jewish Passover, which they said they received from John. But it's very clear that Anicetus is trying to kind of press upon them. No. We're supposed to be worshiping on Sunday. We're supposed to be celebrating the Eucharist on Sunday. That's the Lord's Day. So the background to that, as we've already explained, may have been that, it wasn't okay for these Christians to be celebrating clandestine meetings on Saturday evening. And so it got transferred. And then, and like you said, that may have happened even during as early as Peter's time. So it may have been actually for the Roman Church that this is apostolic practice to us. So what are you guys doing? So it brings up this whole interesting controversy in the church about the dating of Easter. And of course, as we know from the famous source in Eusebius, he records the famous incident through an Irenaeus where Polycarp, remember, Polycarp is the follower of John the Apostle directly, okay? Polycarp takes it upon himself to travel to Rome, not only to debate some Gnostic teachers that were there, like Marcion and so forth, but he goes there and he actually steps in and celebrates the Eucharist in Rome with Anicetus. Like, Anicetus actually allows him to come and just celebrate the Eucharist in Rome. That is, we have to stop there, like there's a lot going on there for liturgy, right? That the fact that the liturgy could be so, at least similar enough across the empire for somebody to just step right in and know what to do, So Polycarp steps right in Rome and celebrates the Eucharist. But it's great that he does this because Polycarp's tradition is to celebrate on Saturday night. But when he's in Rome, he adopts the Roman practice and he celebrates it on the day of the sun, right? On the morning of the sun, according to Anicetus' tradition. Right. And in doing this, it actually says in the sources that it actually solidified the peace of the churches, because this controversy was already starting to bubble up and get really hot. And this solitary act by Polycarp with Anicetus kind of solves the crisis that was potentially going to emerge for the churches.
Yeah.
I bring this up not only because it's just like an awesome story, but Also because of what it says to us about liturgy, the kind of the unity of the liturgy across the empire, in an ancient empire where you don't have texting, you don't have emails, you don't have media, you don't have any, like, this is literally just prayers, traditions, ways of doing things that are passed down. And somehow Polycarp from Smyrna is able to step right in. That's very interesting, and that's going to be very important as we talk about second century liturgy in a future episode. So keep that in mind. But the other thing is, you're going to see this theme where bishops of Rome, when there's a controversy, you never see the bishops of Rome get up and travel to another see. I don't know why this is, and I don't know what you think about this, Dan, but like, it's just fascinating to me that they never go anywhere. They'll send representatives, they'll write letters, but it's always, like, invariably, if there is a controversy that's going to be settled with something with Rome, it's bishops kind of coming to Rome, to do it. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how much we can bake into that, if I'm going to be, like, fair and responsible. But at the same time, I think you can bake quite a bit into that, right?
The Roman popes are too cool.
But there's something about, just that, like, the Roman bishop is not going to leave Rome,
Yeah.
And even at this early period, and it is
cool,
astounding. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it is a cool thought.
Yeah. And it is astounding that we're already talking about, hey, how are we supposed to properly celebrate Easter? And these people know the apostles. Like Polycarp knew the Apostle John. So already we're talking about feasts, calendars. It gives us a hint into what the Christians really do think about their gatherings and what they're doing. Because Jews had feasts, Jews had the calendar. Mm-hmm. Of course, surrounded by or at least growing up out of the cult of the temple. So it shows us again that Christians see their community, their gatherings, as something very formal, right? I don't know how else to put it, but ritualistic, sacramental, liturgical, whatever you want to say. But they see what they're, and constantly, even in that document of the life of Polycarp, we even see again this whole idea of, like, oh yeah, and then the deacons, the Levites, they see themselves as a cult, like truly, in the best sense of that word, in the ancient sense of that word, like they see themselves as a cultus, with a hierarchy, with rituals, with calendars, with feast days. I don't know. I mean, that's kind of the stuff that we're starting to glean from a lot of this, right?
Yeah, those are great takeaways. I would say the other big takeaway from this discussion on when do we celebrate the primary Eucharist is the whole Jewish element, the growing separation between Christianity and Judaism itself. Christianity is beginning to build an identity here over and against the Judaism of their day. Now, what's important about that is that the Judaism of their day is also in development. The Judaism of the second century is not the Judaism of the first century. And as much as we could say that Christianity is evolving in the second century, you could say the same exact thing about Judaism evolving in the second century. You think about all the cataclysmic events that happened to the Jews, right? The war against, the rebellion against Rome. Rome crushes them, completely devastates Jerusalem, kicks out all the Jews. Only Romans can occupy that city. The Jews are kicked out and sent as slaves, back to Rome. Cataclysmic events are happening within the Jewish community, and what ends up happening is this emergence of the rabbinic Judaism. And so, as Christians are beginning to build identity, they're building that identity over and against the Judaism that they're seeing, the rabbinic Judaism that they're seeing in the second century. And so, what I think is an important takeaway, and this little Saturday evening, Sunday morning kind of thing, is it Sabbath? Is it first day of the week? That border starts to get a little thicker as Christians more and more start to emphasize their own day, whether that means Saturday evening or Sunday morning. That doesn't really matter because it's the first day of the week, no matter what, according to the Jewish reckoning. But that border becomes thicker and thicker as you move into the second century. And this move that we're talking about kind of highlights the beginning of the parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity.
Yeah.
And so
and
and so
eventually
a lot
we're
of
gonna
times
go ahead.
and so a lot of times folks will want to see the separation of Christianity from Judaism. We talk about this often. They want to see it as kind of a lowercase r event. You have the stem, and then the Christians kind of go off to define themselves, and kind of Judaism continues on through the centuries.
Right.
That's not the case. What you really have is a very thick stem and a Y happening. So the thick stem is first century Judaism, which includes all types of Judaisms, which we've talked about, Christianity being one of those. And, you think about Christians didn't call themselves Christians in the first century. They called themselves the Way. They were the way within Judaism. So Judaism had a larger umbrella, in other words, in the first century. But events like this, things like this, where Christians begin to emphasize the eighth day over and against the Sabbath, you start to see the separating out and this Y event beginning between Judaism and Christianity, two evolving religions from one larger umbrella.
Well, and also the annual celebration of Easter in Rome on a Sunday rather than, as in some of these Eastern churches, on the 14th of Nisan in accordance with the Jewish Passover. So, in some Eastern churches, you're going to have Jews and Christians celebrating a holy day on the same day, right? So there's like that common identity still in like the calendar, but in other places like Rome, it is otherwise. They're starting to see like, well, wait a second, like they don't even celebrate the Passover, so there's definitely a drifting that is already starting to take place between the two. But you also have the seeds, very early seeds, like the mustard seeds of eventual controversies between East and West here. I mean, even to this day, there's controversies over how to date Easter, but you do have here already kind of like, well, Rome has a practice, some of us out here have another one, like what's going on, and Rome is willing to kind of press itself a little bit, and the Eastern Church is like, well, wait a second, Rome, like wait, it's okay, so you have this kind of trajectory that is being set. Slowly but surely, and I'm sure that the Christians of the time had no idea, of course, but in hindsight, we can look back and say, here's a moment, here's a moment maybe to think about when we talk about this eventual, all the way into the Middle Ages of the rift between East and West. The seeds of that are all already kind of being planted, and the very idea that you can have two apostolic practices passed on to churches. And then they have to sort of figure out, well, which one's going to win out. I think that's kind of inconceivable in a way to maybe the simple reader of early church history that the apostles may have delivered two different traditions to different churches.
But again, that's why it makes sense to say that it was external circumstances that created the tradition, right? At least maybe for Rome. That the Christians of Rome were forced into the tradition of Sunday mornings, and then that became the tradition from the apostles.
Yeah. And then just to bring it home, I mean, I know that there's a lot of controversy in Roman Catholicism. I know that like a lot of the quote unquote trads, will say that like, the Saturday evening mass, they'll say, no, you got to have a Sunday morning, The Eastern churches, like the Eastern Orthodox, actually will have like a heavy rhetoric against Rome for having this kind of Saturday vigil mass that counts towards your obligation for the Sunday mass. But when you look at the history here, right, I mean, it's almost like, the Saturday vigil mass is kind of cool.
Yeah, it can take on a new significance for us Roman Christians, knowing that actually Saturday evening masses may have been the very first primary day for the earliest Christians. But there's evidence of Saturday evening Eucharist as the primary day of worship, stretching all the way into the 4th century in Asia Minor, in Syria, but also on the outskirts of Egypt. The monks of Egypt were celebrating, were celebrating their Eucharists on Saturday evenings, which again wasn't a recent aberration. It was probably passed on from the earliest of times.
Yeah, yeah. So good. So I think that's pretty good. So we'll continue our first 500-year series. I think this is good to set the tone for a lot of the themes that we're going to pull out in the next few episodes to get us through the second century. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and you can take away some great points from here, some fascinating points. But the end of the matter is it's a very complicated topic because of the scarcity of the sources and how sparse they are. But ultimately what we're saying is that we are moving into a stage where Christians are going to be celebrating their primary feast each week on Sunday.